VPAP was founded to bring campaign finance information for Virginia politics onto this newfangled thing back in 1997 called the internet. I don't know if you've heard of it, but we put those on the internet back in 1997. And essentially what it comes down to is it's one thing when a politician says, let's go down to the basic local level, right? Running for board of supervisors, and there's a candidate out there and he says, or she says, I don't want any more growth, And then you go look at their campaign finance report and they're just, most of their donors are from developers or real estate, interests. And you're like, wait a minute, you don't want more growth, but everybody who wants to build, property here in our county is supporting your campaign. So something doesn't match up.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Discover Virginia podcast. I'm Joseph Trahan, your host for the #1 video podcast in Virginia, where we explore the rich history, vibrant culture, and iconic businesses that make our Commonwealth truly special and worth talking about. So get ready as together we discover Virginia. Chris, thank you so much for being on the show today. We appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I'd love to get started with what exactly brought you to Richmond and how did you get interested in nonpartisan politics?
Well, I actually came first to go to VCU and finish up my college career here. I bounced back and forth from DC to here in Richmond in a couple of different roles. But essentially, I majored in political science. I was not in love with any political party or any particular political candidate, but I knew I wanted to work in politics. So very excited to work in politics, and I eventually got a job as campaign finance manager at the Virginia State Board of Elections. And that was the perfect it was a perfect fit for somebody who was interested in politics and the machinations of politics, but didn't actually want to work for politicians.
So from the days as Commissioner of Elections to your current role as VPAP, how's your personal experience really shaped your view to making political information more accessible and also better and easier to understand?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, VPAP was a perfect fit for me because I'm a nonpartisan by nature. And VPAP is, in its mission statement states very clearly that we are fiercely nonpartisan. I've always enjoyed, again, the process of politics. And what's really important to me is that I think some people look at politics as this thing that's like inaccessible. It's something that's far away. It's people in power doing games and whatnot. Yeah. And so they can disassociate with it. And what I think is really important is if they just had the knowledge at their fingertips. I can understand like government and how the machinations of government work can seem really complex and kind of difficult to understand. What VPAP does that I've been so excited to be able to work on is, take this complex information, boil it down into easy to understand, quick little tidbits. And while I think people like to complain about the younger generations and their attention spans being so short, I think we all have really short attention spans and really have over the last few years. So, it's not just kids, it's not just adults, it's the wide spectrum of people. If we can give really complex information, something quick and easy for you to understand, I think that's going to be a benefit for everybody so they can participate in the process. Absolutely.
And it goes into a wider net of casting transparency, right?
Yeah. I mean, really what it's all about is, sometimes we just think that the government is doing what the government does and we don't really have, and they're doing it all behind back rooms and the old cigars and whatnot. Yeah, sure. And that's actually not the way it is. We have a very open and transparent government as it is. And VPAP just collects all that information and puts it in one spot so somebody can become informed just before they go to the ballot box.
Why is transparency so important to democracy, especially ours?
Well, I think that in order to, let's take it back to the most fundamental right we have as citizens in the United States, and that's to vote, right? And, in order to do a good job voting, essentially we have to have information. We have to understand who it is we're voting for and what we want them to do when they get into office. And then we have to be able to look back and say, did you do what you say you were going to do? Did you, or, if you didn't, why? And that information all has to be there in order for us to make informed choices when we get to the ballot box. So really what it comes down to is transparency is critical in order for us to grade the performance of the representatives that we elected into office.
Yeah, absolutely too. Especially like going back and saying, did you do what you say you were going to do? I think that's where the misconception for a lot of individuals comes into play, where it's like, okay, well, now it's gone. Like where did the information go, right? Where you guys at VPAP are doing an excellent job of providing that information in those tidbits of information through the newsletter and also through the website. I'm curious, like, how does having access to this data empower individuals, and how do you guys, how does VPAP go about empowering individuals to, do their due diligence and vote while also saying, hey, we're not promoting one party or the other?
Sure. Well, I think, at the basic level, VPAP was founded to bring campaign finance information for Virginia politics onto this newfangled thing back in 1997 called the internet. I don't know if you've heard of it, but we put those on the internet back in 1997. And essentially what it comes down to is it's one thing when a politician says, let's go down to the basic local level, right? Running for board of supervisors, and there's a candidate out there and he says, or she says, I don't want any more growth, and then you go look at their campaign finance report and they're just, most of their donors are from developers or real estate,
Right.
interests. And you're like, wait a minute, you don't want more growth, but everybody who wants to build, property here in our county is supporting your campaign. So something doesn't match up. And so it's really about having that information. I mean, I'm not saying, I think 99 out of 100 candidates are good people that want to do the right thing. But it's a matter of being able to, back up what they're saying with their actions.
Sure.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think that voters should probably understand that what we're doing is we're the boss and we're grading their performance. And then we're giving them a job interview at the same time if they're not an incumbent. Yeah. And so you want to be able to look and say, you said you're going to do this. You said, you want to do this. What do the actions say?
Yeah. What are some of the biggest misconceptions you've seen at the local level when it comes to politics?
In today's world, I think the biggest misconception is really, it's a fundamental flaw in our education system right now in understanding civics and how government works. I've talked to people who are running for school board, and they were being asked what their position on abortion was. And the thing is that a school board member has no impact on abortion policy at the local level, at the state level. You talk to state legislative candidates or state legislators, and they get questions about what are you going to do about the war in Ukraine. They're a state legislator, so they don't have any influence over those sorts of things.
It's not even their job to do that.
Precisely.
Right? Yeah.
So I think the biggest misconception is just about the division of government. How does, who does what and what are their responsibilities so we can grade them on those sorts of things. And one of the reasons we started up our Civics Navigator program to help bridge that divide and get people, especially students, a better understanding of, how government is split up and who does what.
Right. Because it can almost be easy. And I'm curious on your opinion here, Chris. I would argue that local politics have more of an impact on us in our daily lives than it does at the national level.
Yeah. I mean,
how does that pendulum swing for you?
That's exactly what I say. I say it on a regular basis. I think we've seen, a pulling back of local media and a focus on local media. So used to be that you would wake up and just about everybody was reading from the same newspaper, right?
Sure,
and they were focused on basically the same news source, and they were focused on their community. So they understood a little bit better about the impact of local government versus national government. And unfortunately now, the internet's a great thing, but I think we have seen an outweighed attention on national politics, when in actuality, what's happening in our own backyard is having a bigger impact on our day-to-day lives. Mm-hmm. And Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, they're not going to fix your pothole. They're not going to fix the traffic congestion in your neighborhood, and they're not going to repave the roads. And so there's having a fundamental understanding of how you can really have an impact on your life by participating locally is really important kind of information to be providing out to the public.
What do you say to those who say, local government doesn't really affect me. My vote doesn't really count. What does that conversation look like? Because I think it comes from a place of frustration, right? Because those individuals typically have voted before, maybe once or twice. And if you're only focused on the national level, you don't see the pothole being fixed. So how does reshaping that perspective work? And then how do you just have a conversation and discuss those objections to local government doesn't really matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that VPAP is working so hard on is, I think when you look at Congress, you look at the presidency, I mean, it's almost like, it just seems so inaccessible. Right. It seems like it's so far. There's no way I could actually go and talk to my congressperson and affect change. And like, there's 434 other congresspersons, and then you have the
if you try to drive to DC, there's traffic for 3 hours, right? Yeah, you can barely even get there.
Whereas I don't think people realize how incredibly accessible Virginia state and local government is. Mm-hmm. You can, during session, go and meet with your legislator. You can meet with other legislators that are on a committee dealing with a bill that's important to you. You can go to your board of supervisors, your city council. In most instances, they're going to want to hear from you. And they're going to be very respectful and desiring of your opinion. Again, remember, it's so important to reframe this as I'm not just a voter, but I'm really kind of your boss, and like, right. I'm not saying you have to do, and I understand that you have to, think about the community as a whole. But if you're not having your voice heard, then your part of the community is not being heard. And so I think one of the things we try to do is make that information accessible. And make it easy to understand so that you can go to your representative and affect change. And it really helps when you have the information, at your fingertips.
Yeah, absolutely too, because that information then leads to knowing what type of questions to ask, right?
Precisely.
Not asking the school board member their position on abortion because their job doesn't affect that whatsoever.
100%.
Could you break down the political makeup for us in the Richmond area and what that generally looks like? And how it affects the state and the bigger picture throughout the Commonwealth. So
direct Richmond metropolitan area, sure. It's been a bit of a transition. If you look at the Richmond metropolitan area, you can look at the city of Richmond, which has always been historically, Democratic leaning. Chesterfield and Henrico, the counties that immediately surround the city of Richmond. Chesterfield 20 years ago was a pretty big red spot on the state map and heavily Republican leaning. But we have seen in the last couple of presidential election cycles and all the elections in between a movement toward Democrat. And the same with Henrico. I mean, that was a little bit faster coming and earlier on than Chesterfield, but we're starting to see this general area really turning to the blue shade on the map. Then you get a little bit further out. You look at Goochland, Hanover, maybe even New Kent, Powhatan. Those counties remain pretty solidly Republican. Sure. But again, I think the one thing you can say about Richmond is regionally they work really well together and have historically worked pretty well together. So. I don't know that you can say red and blue as much at the local level, but when it comes to state and national elections, they tend to, again, Democrat, blue, city of Richmond, and a little bit lighter blue when
Right.
you get out to the
And
county.
Virginia isn't always necessarily painted as the swing state, right? It's pretty much made its mind prior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for we for a long time it was a very red state. At the national level, it was like 19. I think Johnson was the last one they voted for before Obama in 2008.
Okay.
So the last Democrat that Virginia voted for. But at the local and state level, it was largely Democratic, with governors being from both parties during that period since Johnson. And now, it was pretty red in the late 90s, 2000s, and the 2010s until 2017. Following Trump's election, we started trending more blue.
Sure. And just for clarification and a friendly reminder to our listeners, this is a nonpartisan view, right? We are looking at different colors of the map, just seeing where the information can be best collected and utilized. So going back to VPAP's mission, how do you ensure it remains neutral and continues to provide unbiased information, especially for an organization that relies, heavily on volunteers and donations to make the organization and the information come together?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a commitment internally. Nobody on the team and under our employ is allowed to have a bumper sticker advocating, one candidate over the other. Our board is made up of even parts of Democrats and Republicans.
Sure. Is that something that they do disclose before coming onto the team?
Yeah.
Okay.
We as the board is choosing its members, they're very, very focused on making sure there's an even split between them.
Interesting.
If you look at our data visualizations, we provide some information. We have a little bit of text to provide some amount of context. But we work very, very hard. In fact, as soon as I walk out of here, I'm going to be looking at some text to make sure that we're not trying to swing your thoughts one way or the other. It's just ingrained in each of us that we are there to provide information. For me, it comes from a career of working in elections and ethics, governmental ethics. It's not about red or blue. It's about the person having the opportunity to make a decision.
Yeah.
So we're heavily focused on making sure that we present information that you can look at and determine how it impacts your beliefs and your values.
Yeah. Chris, as we come to the end of our conversation today, I'm curious, what do you think are the most important action steps or the most important items that we can begin to work through to foster connection and community in a way that is not only respectful to one another, but helps the community by and large, especially when it comes to politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think being an informed citizen, I don't necessarily believe anybody has to be, in the game of politics and following it every day in and day out. But I think there's a couple of things that are really critical. Is right before an election, come to vpap.org. Take a look at your candidates. Starting tomorrow, you can type in your address into our system. So tomorrow being October 22nd, up to the election. But you can type in your address and you can see everybody who's on your ballot. And then, you can look into the funding of those candidates.
You can see who's betting on them, right?
Yeah. You can see who's supporting their campaign.
You can see who's supporting their campaign. Sorry, yes. Chris has a very nonpartisan view. I like to go for the entertaining value. You can see who's betting on who. But you can see who's supporting what cause, right?
Yeah, I think so. Before the election, take the time, to research and to understand who you're voting for and why you're voting for them. It's really easy to just walk into the ballot booth, and if they've got an R next to their name or a D next to their name, and you just check whoever that is. But why not do a little bit more research and understand what their role is, how they can impact your life on a daily basis. And then lastly, I think, if you don't want to do it year round, certainly right before the election, but also here in Virginia, the General Assembly meets every year, January, mid-January through usually about mid-March, depending on the year. But anyway, they're in session here in Richmond. They're very accessible.
That's a public thing that you can go to and attend, right?
Yeah, you can even, you can watch committee meetings. For a lot of people, I'm sure that would be a really boring thing. But, check out what's going on, see the bills that are being proposed. I think one thing I would leave your listeners with that I think is really important. We think of ourselves as a very divided country. And no doubt, I think that, we can all agree that there's pretty big division in this country right now. But if you look at what we put out last year at the end of the General Assembly session, 80% of the bills that came to the House and Senate floor for a full vote were nearly unanimous or unanimous. Meaning that only 20% of bills that actually were voted on in the General Assembly, on the floor of the General Assembly, had, partisan or disagreements enough that, it was either party line votes or near party line votes. But that's only when you're talking about 1,000 bills, that's not a lot,
Yeah.
We generally do get along.
Those are some good stats.
Yeah. And here in Virginia, the General Assembly actually gets work done. And why not come be part of that process and see how it works? You can follow along all of the General Assembly's actions right there on our website. And I just encourage people to take an active role in their community, not just at the state level, not just during presidential elections. There's a lot going on all the time that impact your life, and you have a voice. You can use it not just at the ballot box.
Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Glad to be here.